Our next speaker is a wonderful person who's a developmental pediatrician who's committed her life to working with children with disabilities and their families. Trained at the Boston Children's Hospital, she founded Umeed Child Development Center about 15 years ago in Mumbai. And she's an expert in the area and an advisor on child development and disabilities to the Government of India, WHO, and UNICEF. Please welcome Vibha Krishnamurthy.
Thank you. Okay, 15 minutes to tell the story of my life. And I was told, make sure it inspires everyone and changes their life. No pressure. So I'll try. The first thing I have to say is that introduction, that I'm a developmental pediatrician and I work with children with special needs, children with disabilities and their families, often leaves people looking politely interested, and I can see what's going on in their mind. They're thinking, well, that's interesting, but it doesn't really concern me. It's not really relevant to me. And I can see some of you in the audience may be thinking that anyway today also. What I do hope to do in the next few minutes is to convince all of you that it's not only relevant to you, that the work that I do is of critical importance to everyone sitting here. So I'll begin. Let's begin with the statistic. At least 1 in every 10 children has a disability. That's a pretty startling statistic. It was for me, at least, when I first heard it. 1 in every 10 children. You seem a little surprised. I mean, how can that possibly be? It couldn't really be 1 in every 10 children because if that was the case, I'd be seeing more kids with disabilities, wouldn't I? But the operative word there is see. Because when you're thinking of disability, you're thinking of things that you can see. Like this young man who's my patient. When Tanay's parents first came to see me, Tanay was just 2 days old. He has Down syndrome. His parents knew that when he's born with an extra chromosome, the chances are that he's going to be late in his speech, he's going to be late to walk and talk, and that his developmental potential may be challenged because of his genetic condition. And so when you think of disability, you think of a child with Down syndrome, you think of a person with a hearing aid, you think of someone in a wheelchair, but that's really not the end of it. Think of all the kids out there who are struggling to speak. The child in the classroom who's struggling to pay attention. The kid with dyslexia who's not able to write. The child with autism who looks like anybody else, but is struggling to make social connections with people. That's also the realm of disability that I'm talking about. And then let's look at this little guy. This little guy's name is Prakash. I took this photograph when I was actually traveling in Rajasthan, and I walked into a village and all the little girls came out because the girls don't go to school. The little girls came out carrying the little infant siblings with them. And this little girl was 12 years old. Her brother's name was Prakash. And I looked at Prakash, who's about 10 months old, and I knew that he's going to have a developmental disability. I know that he's going to have a developmental delay. How do I know that? I know that because 1 in 2 kids in India is going to be malnourished. We know that already. That's a real statistic in our country. 48% of children under the age of 5 are malnourished. The other statistic I know for sure is that children with anemia under the age of 3 is 75%. So 75% of the kids under the age of 3 are anemic. Both anemia and malnutrition change your IQ. They change the way you think, they change the way they develop. And Prakash is most likely going to have both. But the third and most important thing that I want to point out to you is that children's brains in the first 3 years of life are exquisitely sensitive to the interaction that they have with a caring caregiver. What does that mean? Not having a parent to care for him, for this little boy. His mother works in the fields. Not having that mother who talks to him, plays with him, interacts with him, means that his development is going to be less than optimal. And that is why this little boy is almost certainly going to have a developmental delay. So now that I've told you the gamut of what I'm talking about when I talk about early childhood disability, you can imagine that this statistic of at least 1 in 10, in fact, it's actually not 1 in 10, it's more like 1 in 6, in low and middle income countries particularly, we're talking about 15% of children being born with a developmental disability. What is that in absolute numbers in India? 53 million. We're talking about an epidemic. We're talking about something that's your future workforce pipeline. We're talking about the limited potential of an entire country. And then I'll come to something which is even more startling that we know through science. The jury is in on what works to fix this situation. We know what works. If you identify early those kids who are at risk, like little Prakash, or my little boy with Down syndrome, Tanay, if you identify those kids early and you intervene early by teaching their parents how to stimulate their brains in the first few years of life, you can change the outcome. And what do I mean by the outcome? The kids who are identified early and intervened with early end up having better IQ scores, they end up doing better in school, and they end up earning more money. Professor Heckman, I guess many of you may be familiar with that. That study just came out in 2014. When you identify these kids before the age of 3 and you intervene early, the outcomes are great in terms of economic advantages for countries too. So now I come to the piece which is really, really relevant for all of us in this room to know. The first 3 years of life are so crucial because 80% of our brain's growth and development happens in the first 3 years of life. And the key thing over there, which helps our brains develop, is how you engage with the child. So have you heard the expression, your child's brain is a sponge? How many of you have heard that, right? It is my pet peeve. Your child's brain is not a sponge, okay? It's not an empty box, it's not a vending machine. You do not stuff things in a child's brain. Your child's brain is like a game of tennis. That's what it's like. So when the child serves, when the baby coos and you coo back to the baby and you respond, that's what makes the child's brain develop. That's when those neurons connect with each other and those synapses develop. So that interactive response in the first 3 years of life is critical to the child's development. I'm going to teach you a little bit of neuroscience. This is a PET scan. Okay, and if you look at it, it's sort of if I sliced your brain right through the top and the front part is on top of the slide, the back part of your brain is at the bottom of the slide. The red, green and yellow parts are where the brain is active. And this is the brain of a normal 3-year-old in Romania. Many of you know about the Romanian orphan crisis, and this actually is a study that was done in Romania, the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. And it was very interesting. This was a 3-year-old who grew up in a regular household in the community. The circles that you see in the child's brain are the temporal lobes of the brain. This is the part of the brain where social interaction and language rests. So your ability to connect with people, interact with people, and develop language appropriately is within those circles. In a healthy 3-year-old, this is what it looks like. There's lots of red, yellow, and green activity happening inside that child's brain. The black parts of the brain are just the normal fluid-filled portions of the brain. The next slide I'm going to show you is of a child who grew up in a Romanian orphanage, also about 3 to 4 years old. Now the difference in the next child is because he grew up in an orphanage, he did not have a caring adult in his life who knew how to play, interact, and get that tennis game going. And here's what his brain looked like. So we know this. This is hard science. This is not soft, fuzzy stuff. We know that not engaging and interacting with kids early is limiting their potential. Okay? So the next part of what I'm going to talk about is how I came to this point. So I didn't know this stuff either when I was growing up. In fact, I came to this knowledge very late in my life. It wasn't easy for me to pick medicine. You did well in science, you got into medicine in my times. It wasn't difficult for me to pick pediatrics either because I knew that I loved children and I wanted to be with children. The turning point happened when I went to the US when I was 27 years old. And I knew that I was going to be there for a few years, and I thought, what can I take back with me that I know nothing about? And the answer was surprisingly simple. I knew how to save kids who were dying. I knew how to treat tubercular meningitis. I knew how to treat children with, all kinds of diseases. But what I did not know was how to work with children who had developmental issues. How do children's brains work? How can we influence how their brains work? And that's how I ended up doing a fellowship in Boston on child development and disability. And the 5 years that I was there, I was struck by two things. One, that it seemed that there were so many of these kids here. How come I never saw them in India? And the answer I know now, right? The eye doesn't see what the mind does not know. I had never seen kids with developmental problems. I assure you, when you walk out of this talk today, you're going to see at least 5 kids who you worry about having a developmental concern in the next week, for sure, right? Because at least 1 in the 10 families that you know have a child with a developmental issue that you haven't known about yet. The second thing that really struck me was the paucity of services in India. In the best of the metros that I had worked, in Delhi, Bombay, I had never come across the kind of services that I was seeing. So it was clear that when I came back, what I wanted to do was to start a center. So that's where my journey with Umeed began. Umeed means hope, and that's what I wanted for kids with disabilities in India. It was very important for me to have a team that philosophically believed in what I believed in, that families are the stronghold for every child where the action happens, that family-centered care is how we can address the needs of children. Secondly, that all families have strengths. The poorest of the poor families want the best for their children. They want the kids to go to an English medium school. They want them to work in an office, right? And if they were empowered with the knowledge that they can change their child's brain, they would do that. And lastly, this had to be care for all, not just those who can afford it. So we started with 4 of us under one roof, seeing about 4 patients a day. And we've come a long way since then. We see about 7,000 patient visits a year at Umeed, and we are 62 of us working together. But what was interesting was, even though we were reaching out to kids like this one, the previous kid that you saw, the one with Down syndrome, what I could not reach out to was this child. So the child you see here is a photograph that I took right outside Umeed. This family lives in that concrete tube all through the monsoons and pretty much through the rest of the year. How do I reach out to kids like that? I can reach out to the child with Down syndrome whose parents are educated, whose parents know how to access our center. But how do I reach out to kids like that? And therein came the idea that in order to reach out to the population that's most vulnerable, you need to reach out to people who have access to them. And that for me was parents, community health workers, teachers, doctors, anybody who would care to be trained. So that's when our whole capacity building program began. In 2008, with funding from USAID, we began our first program for community health workers. And we taught them how to promote child development, make parents aware of how important it is, identify kids with disabilities early, and teach parents how to work with them. Through that, again, we've come a long way. We do multiple trainings, and this year we begin our training center in September, which will cater to all these audiences. The journey is far from over, because basically, while we have trainings that exist, part of the problem is that not everybody is banging on our doors to get trained in working with children with disability. Not everybody knows that this is a need, and therefore it's not a demand yet. So our journey to build awareness and advocacy for children with disabilities and at risk continues. During the journey, I heard Professor Gupta say that if it's lonely on the top, you're doing something wrong. And I truly believe that's true, because I've never ever felt lonely on the top. I've had a wonderful team who's been with me right through. That's my senior management team at the Christmas party. And one thing I do know, that whenever they're there, this is how I feel. I wake up every morning determined both to change the world and to have one hell of a good time. And sometimes that makes planning the day difficult. Thank you.